The autumn sun filtered through the massive windows of the Whitmore estate in Savannah, Georgia, casting golden rays across the marble floors that had been polished to perfection by faithful hands. Those hands belonged to Miriam Foster, a 43-year-old widow who had cleaned this mansion for the past 6 years, always humming hymns under her breath as she worked. "Get that child away from my daughter immediately." The voice of Thomas Whitmore thundered through the conservatory, causing 11-year-old Grace Foster to stop mid-twirl, her simple cotton dress still swaying from the momentum of her dance. Grace had been showing 8-year-old Charlotte Whitmore a dance she had learned at her church's youth group, a joyful expression of faith set to contemporary Christian music that played softly from Charlotte's tablet. Charlotte, confined to her custom wheelchair since a car accident 3 years prior, had been laughing for the first time in months, her pale face flushed with happiness as she moved her arms in rhythm with Grace's steps. "Mr. Whitmore, I am so sorry." She was just trying to cheer up Charlotte. Miriam rushed in from the kitchen, her worn hands still damp from washing the crystal stemware. Her face, usually serene with the peace that comes from deep faith, was now etched with worry. "I explicitly told you to keep your daughter in the kitchen area when she accompanies you here." Thomas stood rigid in his tailored suit, his steel-grey eyes cold as winter. "This is not a playground for your child to spread her religious nonsense to Charlotte." Charlotte reached out toward Grace, tears beginning to form in her bright blue eyes. "Daddy, please, Grace was just showing me a happy dance. I liked it. She made me forget about—" "Enough, Charlotte." Thomas cut her off, his voice sharp enough to wound. "Grace has no business filling your head with fairy tales about imaginary friends in the sky. We are people of science and reason in this house, not superstition." Grace stood there, her 11-year-old heart breaking not for herself, but for Charlotte, who rarely had anyone her age to play with. The private tutors came and went. The physical therapists maintained professional distance, and the household staff had been instructed to minimize interaction with the young heiress. "Mr. Whitmore," Miriam said softly, her southern accent thick with emotion. Grace meant no harm. She was only sharing joy with Charlotte. "Sometimes children need—" "What children need," Thomas interrupted, his voice dripping with condescension, "is proper education and guidance from qualified individuals, not the daughter of a cleaning woman filling their heads with Bronze Age mythology. Your daughter lacks the sophistication and intellectual foundation to be a suitable companion for Charlotte." Grace felt each word like a physical blow, but something deeper stirred within her. Her late father, a Baptist minister who had passed away 3 years ago, had always taught her that God could use any situation for good. She looked at Thomas Whitmore, this man who had built his tech empire on artificial intelligence and machine learning, who believed human consciousness was merely electrical impulses and chemical reactions, and she felt something she wouldn't understand until years later. It was pity. "Pack your things, Miriam," Thomas said, pulling out his phone. "I'll have accounting cut your final check. You're terminated, effective immediately." "But Mr. Whitmore, I need this job." Miriam's voice cracked. "Grace's education, our rent. You should have thought about that before allowing your daughter to contaminate mine with your primitive beliefs," Thomas replied, without looking up from his phone. "Security will escort you out." As Miriam gathered Grace and their few belongings, Charlotte's sobs echoed through the marble halls. "Daddy, you're being mean. Grace is my only friend." "You'll make appropriate friends at the Swiss boarding school I'm enrolling you in next month," Thomas replied, already walking away. "Friends from families who understand the importance of rational thought." Grace looked back one last time as security led them through the service entrance. Charlotte was slumped in her wheelchair, her small shoulders shaking with tears. Their eyes met, and Grace mouthed the words, "God loves you, Charlotte." 22 years passed like pages turning in a book only God could read. Grace Foster, now 33, stood at the podium of the International Conference on Pediatric Neurology in Atlanta, her doctorate from Johns Hopkins gleaming as brightly as her faith. But she wasn't there as Dr. Grace Foster, neurologist. She was there as Grace Foster, founder of Miracles in Motion, a revolutionary therapy program that combined cutting-edge neuroscience with something the medical establishment had long dismissed, the documented healing power of faith-based movement therapy. "Ladies and gentlemen," Grace addressed the packed auditorium, "for too long we've separated the spiritual from the scientific in medicine. But what if I told you that patients who engage in purposeful, faith-inspired movement show 37% better outcomes in neural pathway regeneration than those who undergo traditional physical therapy alone?" The audience murmured with interest and skepticism in equal measure. Grace clicked to the next slide, showing brain scans that lit up like Christmas trees. "These are PET scans from our 5-year study. When patients engage in what we call worship movement therapy, combining prayer, music, and choreographed movement, their brains show increased activity in regions associated with motor function recovery, but also in areas linked to hope, joy, and determination." She didn't mention that this discovery had been born from memories of dancing in a marble conservatory with a lonely girl in a wheelchair. She didn't mention that every success story in her program was, in her heart, a prayer for Charlotte Whitmore, wherever she was now. The universe, or as Grace would say, God, has a sense of timing that defies human comprehension. 3 days after her groundbreaking presentation, Grace received a call that made her stop in the middle of preparing Sunday school lessons at her church. "Dr. Foster, this is Dr. Harrison from Emory University Hospital. We have a patient, Charlotte Whitmore, age 30. She's suffering from a rare degenerative condition that's causing progressive paralysis. We've exhausted traditional treatments and, well, someone mentioned your program." Grace's hand trembled as she held the phone. "Charlotte Whitmore? From Savannah?" "Yes. Do you know her?" "We met once, a long time ago," Grace said softly. "What's her current condition?" "She's lost function from the waist down, and it's progressing upward. We estimate she has perhaps 3 months before respiratory functions are affected. Her father, Thomas Whitmore, is desperate. He's already consulted specialists in Switzerland, Japan, and California. You're actually our last hope." Grace closed her eyes, seeing 11-year-old Charlotte reaching out to her as security escorted them away. "When can I see her?" "Mr. Whitmore insists on meeting you first. He's particular about who treats his daughter." "I'm sure he is," Grace said, a small smile playing at her lips. "Tell him I'll meet him tomorrow at 10. Thomas Whitmore hadn't aged well. The man who once stood like a titan in his marble mansion now sat hunched in the hospital conference room, his hair more silver than she remembered, his eyes hollowed by desperation. He looked up as Grace entered, and she saw the exact moment recognition dawned on his face. "You," he breathed, his voice a mixture of disbelief and something else. Fear, hope. "Hello, Mr. Whitmore," Grace said, extending her hand with the same warmth she would offer anyone. "It's been a long time." Thomas stared at her hand as if it were a snake, then slowly took it. His grip was weak, trembling. You're Dr. Foster, the one with the movement therapy program?" "I am." Grace sat down across from him, her posture relaxed, peaceful. "I understand Charlotte needs help." "This is some kind of joke," Thomas said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Some elaborate revenge scheme?" "Mr. Whitmore," Grace said gently, "revenge belongs to God, not to me. I'm here because Charlotte needs help, and by His grace I might be able to provide it." "Don't," Thomas's voice cracked. "Don't bring your God into this. I've prayed to your God, to any God, to nothing, to everything. None of it works. Science has failed me, reason has failed me, and now you're telling me to trust in fairy tales." "I'm telling you to trust in hope," Grace replied, "and in the documented success of our program. Would you like to see the data?" For the next hour, Grace presented case after case, brain scan after brain scan, testimonial after testimonial. Thomas listened, his analytical mind processing the information even as his atheist worldview warred with the implications. "This is pseudoscience," he finally said, though his protest sounded hollow. "The placebo effect at best." "Then what do you have to lose?" Grace asked. "If it's just placebo, and Charlotte believes it might work, isn't that better than no hope at all?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a voice so small she almost didn't hear it, he said, "I fired your mother, destroyed her references, made sure she couldn't get decent work anywhere in Savannah." "I know," Grace said simply. "She died 5 years ago," Thomas continued, his voice hollow. "I read about it, cancer. The obituary said she died peacefully, surrounded by her church family, full of faith until the end." "She did," Grace confirmed. "She forgave you long before that, Mr. Whitmore. She prayed for you and Charlotte every single day." Thomas looked up sharply. "Why would she do that?" "Because that's what love does," Grace said. "It forgives, it hopes, it perseveres, it never fails." "That's from your Bible," Thomas said bitterly. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, Grace confirmed. "But it's also the foundation of our therapy program, love, hope, and movement, the 3 pillars of neural regeneration." "Charlotte doesn't believe in God," Thomas said. "I made sure of that. I sent her to the finest schools, gave her the best education in logic and reason." "And yet she's asked for me," Grace said gently. "Dr. Harrison mentioned she specifically requested the doctor who combines faith and science." Thomas's face crumpled. She remembered you. After all these years, she remembered the girl who danced with her. She said it was the last time she felt truly happy before I sent her away to school." "Then let me try to bring her that happiness again," Grace said. "Not as the cleaning lady's daughter, but as a doctor who spent 22 years preparing for this moment." The next morning, Grace entered Charlotte's hospital room with a team of specialists and a heart full of prayers. Charlotte was pale, thinner than Grace remembered, her once bright eyes dulled by pain and resignation. But when she saw Grace, something flickered in those eyes. "Grace," Charlotte whispered, "is it really you?" "Hello, Charlotte," Grace said, taking her hand. "I heard you needed someone to dance with you again." Charlotte's laugh was weak but genuine. "I can't even feel my legs anymore. How can I dance? The same way we did when you were 8, Grace said, with your heart, your arms, and your spirit. But this time, we're going to teach your neurons to dance too." Thomas watched from the corner, his skepticism evident, but his desperation keeping him silent. "Charlotte," Grace said, "I need to be honest with you. Our program incorporates prayer and worship music. I know you weren't raised with faith, but—" "I want to try," Charlotte interrupted. "I've tried everything else, and I remember how happy you looked when you danced. Like you had something inside you that couldn't be taken away. I want to feel that." Over the next 3 weeks, Grace and her team worked with Charlotte daily. They started with simple movements, Charlotte's arms swaying to contemporary worship music, while Grace guided her through breathing exercises that incorporated prayer. Thomas watched every session, his discomfort palpable, but his love for his daughter keeping him present. "This is ridiculous," he muttered on day 5, when Charlotte was attempting to move her torso to Amazing Grace. "And yet," Grace said, pulling up Charlotte's latest brain scan on her tablet, "her neural activity has increased by 12% in the motor cortex." Thomas stared at the scan. His expertise in artificial intelligence had given him enough understanding of neural networks to recognize the improvement. That's not possible." "With God, all things are possible," Grace said, then added with a small smile. "But if you prefer, we can call it neuroplasticity, enhanced by rhythmic stimulation and positive emotional engagement." By week 2, Charlotte could wiggle her toes. It was barely perceptible, but the movement was there. Charlotte cried with joy, and even Thomas had to turn away to hide his emotions. "Grace," Charlotte said one evening after a particularly intense session, "can you tell me about your faith? Really tell me. Not the simplified version for the atheist's daughter. Grace sat beside Charlotte's bed, her voice gentle. Faith isn't about having all the answers, Charlotte. It's about trusting that there's a purpose to our struggles, that we're loved beyond measure, and that grace is available to anyone who asks for it. Even to people whose fathers destroy others' lives, Charlotte asked, glancing at Thomas, who stood frozen by the window. Especially to them, Grace said. That's what makes it grace. It's unearned, undeserved, and unlimited. Thomas turned around, his face a mask of pain. How can you sit there and talk about grace when I destroyed your mother's life, when I took away her livelihood out of pure arrogance? Because, Mr. Whitmore, Grace said, my mother taught me that holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. She chose forgiveness, not for you, but for herself, and she taught me to do the same. I don't deserve forgiveness, Thomas said, his voice breaking. No one does, Grace replied. That's the point. Week 3 brought a breakthrough that made medical journals take notice. Charlotte stood up. It was only for 10 seconds, supported by parallel bars, but she stood while worship music played, and Grace guided her through prayer-focused breathing. I feel it, Charlotte gasped. I feel everything, my legs, but also something else. Like electricity, but warm. Like love has a frequency. Thomas was running neural pathway diagnostics on his laptop, his fingers flying over the keys. The signals are strengthening. The degenerative process has not just stopped, it's reversing. This defies everything I know about neuroscience. Maybe, Grace suggested gently, there are things beyond what we know, things that require faith to understand. That night, Thomas found himself alone in the hospital chapel, a place he'd never thought he'd enter. He didn't know how to pray, didn't even believe anyone was listening, but he found himself talking anyway. I'm a hypocrite for being here, he said to the empty room. I've spent my entire life believing in logic, reason, the supremacy of the human intellect. I've mocked people like Miriam Foster, destroyed their lives because I thought their faith made them weak and foolish. He paused, tears streaming down his face. But Miriam's daughter is saving Charlotte. With the very faith I tried to stamp out. If you're there, if you're real, I need to know. Not for me. I don't deserve anything. But for Charlotte. There was no thunderbolt, no voice from heaven. But Thomas felt something he couldn't explain. A warmth, a presence, a sense that he wasn't alone. And for the first time in his life, the brilliant tech mogul considered the possibility that there were forms of intelligence beyond artificial ones. 6 months later, Charlotte Whitmore walked across the stage at Miracles in Motion's annual gala. No wheelchair, no walker, just her own 2 legs carrying her forward. The audience erupted in applause, but Charlotte raised her hand for silence. 6 months ago, I was dying, she said into the microphone, not just physically but spiritually. I had everything money could buy, but nothing that money couldn't. Then God sent me an angel disguised as a doctor, someone my father had wronged terribly years ago. She looked at Grace, who stood at the side of the stage. Dr. Grace Foster didn't just heal my body. She introduced me to a love I didn't know existed, a hope I didn't know was possible, and a faith I didn't know I needed. Charlotte turned to where Thomas sat in the front row. And she taught my father and me that grace isn't about deserving. It's about receiving. Thomas stood slowly, his journey from atheist to questioner to believer, still fresh and sometimes uncertain. I spent my life building artificial intelligence, he said, his voice carrying through the room. But I failed to recognize divine intelligence when it was right in front of me. 22 years ago, I threw out a woman of faith and her daughter because I thought they were beneath us. Today, I stand here as living proof that God uses our worst mistakes to showcase his greatest mercies. He turned to Grace. Dr. Foster, I've transferred 51% ownership of Whitmore Technologies to your Miracles in Motion Foundation. Every AI advancement we make will be used to further understand the connection between faith and healing. And, his voice broke, I'm funding the Miriam Foster Memorial Wing at your new treatment center. Grace stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. Mr. Whitmore, you don't have to— Yes, I do, Thomas interrupted. Not for forgiveness, because you've already given that, but because it's right. Because your mother's faith, which I mocked, saved my daughter through you. Because God used my cruelty to forge your purpose. The gala continued with testimonies from other patients. Children who'd been told they'd never walk again now dancing on stage. Charlotte joined them. Her movements no longer the tentative steps of therapy, but the joyful expression of someone who'd found both physical and spiritual freedom. Later that evening, as the crowd dispersed, Thomas found Grace standing in the garden of the hotel where the gala had been held. The autumn air was crisp, reminiscent of that day 22 years ago when everything changed. I still struggle with it sometimes, Thomas admitted. Faith. It goes against everything I trained myself to believe. Faith isn't the absence of doubt, Mr. Whitmore, Grace said. It's choosing to trust despite the doubt. Please, he said, call me Thomas. Mr. Whitmore was the man who hurt your family. I'm trying to be someone different now. We all are, Grace replied. That's what redemption means. Becoming new. Charlotte appeared, walking steadily toward them. Grace, I've made a decision. I want to go to seminary. I want to learn about this faith that saved me, really learn it, and then I want to help other people find what I found. Thomas looked at his daughter, the girl he'd raised to believe only in what could be measured and quantified, now glowing with purpose that transcended measurement. I suppose that's not the path I planned for you, he said slowly. No, Charlotte smiled. But maybe it's the path God planned for me. Using my suffering to prepare me for my purpose, Charlotte said, just like he used Grace's. As they stood there in the garden, 3 lives intertwined by pain and redeemed by grace. Grace thought about her mother's words all those years ago. Those with good hearts always find a way to shine. Mama, she whispered to the stars, you were right. You were always right. 5 years later, the Miriam Foster Center for Faith-Based Neurological Recovery had become a beacon of hope for patients worldwide. The wedding taking place in its chapel was small, intimate, but profound in its symbolism. Charlotte Whitmore, now an ordained minister and certified movement therapist, was marrying Dr. James Patterson, a former skeptic-turned-believer who'd come to study the center's methods and stayed to become part of its mission. Grace stood as Charlotte's maid of honor, while Thomas, forever changed from the cold businessman he'd once been, prepared to walk his daughter down the aisle. "Are you ready?" he asked Charlotte, his eyes misty. "Daddy," Charlotte said, adjusting her veil, "I've been ready since the day Grace taught me that dancing isn't just about moving your body. It's about moving your soul." Or as the wedding march began, played with a contemporary twist that would have made Miriam Foster smile, Thomas whispered, "I was so wrong about so many things." "And God used your wrongness for rightness," Charlotte whispered back. "That's the miracle, Daddy. Not just that I can walk, but that all of us can walk in grace." The congregation stood as Charlotte walked down the aisle, each step a testimony to the power of faith, forgiveness, and the God who orchestrates redemption from the ashes of human failure. In his sermon, the officiating pastor, who happened to be from the same church where Grace and Miriam had worshipped years ago, spoke about divine reversals. God has a way of turning our greatest humiliations into our greatest platforms for his glory, he said. A cleaning lady's daughter, dismissed as unworthy, becomes the instrument of healing. A man who rejected God becomes a testament to his patience. A paralyzed girl becomes a dancer for the kingdom. This is the economy of heaven, where the last shall be first, and the first shall be last. During the reception, held in the center's garden, Thomas approached Grace with an envelope. "What's this?" Grace asked. "Open it," Thomas said. Inside was a letter, handwritten on expensive stationery. "Dear Grace, if you're reading this, it means I've finally found the courage to give it to you. I wrote this the night after Charlotte took her first steps in your program. For 22 years, I believed I was superior to your mother because of my education, my wealth, my intellect. I believed faith was weakness and science was strength. I built my empire on artificial intelligence while mocking divine intelligence. But you and your mother understood something I'm only beginning to grasp. True intelligence isn't about what we know, but about recognizing what we don't know. True strength isn't about power over others, but power under God. True wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in grace given and received. Your mother died believing I would one day understand this. Her faith saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. She was right. She was always right. I'm establishing the Miriam Foster Foundation for Domestic Workers' Rights, with an initial endowment of $100 million. Every family I've wronged will receive restitution. Every child whose parent was unfairly dismissed will receive a full scholarship. It doesn't undo the harm, but perhaps it can prevent future harm. You asked me once why your mother forgave me. I think I finally understand. She knew that unforgiveness would have made her a prisoner to my cruelty. Instead, she chose freedom. She chose love. She chose God. Thank you for showing me that the dance of faith is available to anyone willing to take the first step, no matter how unlikely a dancer they may be. With deepest respect and gratitude, Thomas Whitmore, a recovering Pharisee learning to dance. Grace held the letter to her chest, tears flowing freely. Thomas, this is beautiful. Your mother once hummed hymns while she cleaned my house, Thomas said. I thought it was ignorant. Now I realize she was the wisest person in that mansion. She knew the secret to joy wasn't in what she possessed, but in who possessed her. As the celebration continued into the evening, Charlotte pulled Grace aside. I have news, she said, her eyes shining. James and I are going to Kenya next month. There's an orphanage there, children with neurological conditions who've been told they'll never walk. We're going to teach them to dance. Your father must be so proud, Grace said. He's coming with us, Charlotte laughed. He says someone needs to document the neural pathway changes for scientific journals, but I think he just wants to see more miracles. We all do, Grace said, looking around at the gathering. Former patients danced with their families, medical professionals mingled with ministers, scientists discussed faith with theologians. It was a picture of what the world could be when human wisdom humbled itself before divine mystery. As the evening wound down, Grace stood at the microphone for a final toast. 11 years old, dancing in a mansion. I never imagined I'd be here. When Mr. Whitmore, Thomas, told my mother I wasn't sophisticated enough to be around his daughter, he was right in one way. I wasn't sophisticated. I was just a little girl who believed God could use anyone for his purposes. She raised her glass. To Miriam Foster, who taught me that faith is the most sophisticated response to a complex world. To Charlotte, who proved that paralysis of the body is nothing compared to paralysis of the spirit. To Thomas, who shows us daily that it's never too late to learn a new dance. And to the God who choreographs redemption from the broken steps of our lives. Amen, the crowd responded, a mixture of believers, seekers, and skeptics united in witnessing something beyond explanation. As Grace walked to her car later that night, she paused at the entrance to the center. A bronze plaque bore her mother's picture and a quote from Proverbs. Many daughters have done virtuously, but thou excellest them all. We did it, Mama, Grace whispered. We showed them that those with good hearts always find a way to shine. 10 years had passed since Charlotte's miraculous recovery. The Miracles in Motion network had expanded to 17 countries, combining cutting-edge neuroscience with faith-based therapy. But tonight, Grace faced her greatest challenge yet. Thomas Whitmore, now 73, lay in the same hospital where Charlotte had been treated. A massive stroke had left him partially paralyzed and unable to speak. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who had once dismissed the paralyzed now faced his own physical prison. Charlotte sat by his bedside, holding his hand. "Grace is coming, Daddy. She's flying in from the conference in Sweden." Thomas's eyes, the only part of him that seemed fully alive, filled with tears. Through blinking, he'd managed to communicate one request: Grace. When Grace arrived, exhausted from the transatlantic flight, but radiating the same peace she'd carried for decades, she found Charlotte crying in the hallway. "The doctors say the damage is extensive," Charlotte sobbed. "They're talking about quality of life, end-of-care decisions. Grace, I can't lose him, not when we've finally found each other in faith." Grace held Charlotte close. "God isn't finished with your father's story, Charlotte. Remember, our God specializes in resurrections, sometimes of the body, always of the spirit." She entered Thomas's room, seeing the once powerful man reduced to stillness. But in his eyes, she saw something that hadn't been there 40 years ago: peace. "Hello, Thomas," she said softly, taking his hand. "I hear you're ready to learn a new dance." For 3 months, Grace worked with Thomas personally, applying every technique she'd developed, every prayer she knew, every ounce of faith she possessed. Progress was slow, agonizing. Some days there was no progress at all. But Thomas never gave up. His eyes, fixed on the cross Charlotte had hung in his room, spoke volumes. He was fighting not just for his body, but for time to make more amends, time to spread the message of grace he'd discovered so late in life. One morning, as Grace guided his hand through therapy movements while worship music played, Thomas's fingers suddenly gripped hers with intention. His mouth moved, forming a single word: "Sorry." It was barely audible, slurred, but it was speech. Charlotte, who'd been reading her Bible in the corner, dropped the book and ran to his side. "Daddy, you spoke!" Over the following weeks, more words came. Simple ones at first: love, God, thank, grace. Each word was a victory, each sentence a miracle. The medical community was astounded. Neurologists from around the world came to study Thomas's case. His recovery defied conventional understanding of stroke rehabilitation. "What's your secret?" a visiting doctor from Tokyo asked Grace. "We treat the whole person," Grace explained, "body, mind, and spirit. When you acknowledge that humans are more than biological machines, healing possibilities expand beyond our current understanding." 6 months after his stroke, Thomas stood at a podium, supported by a walker, but standing on his own power. The audience at the American Neurological Association's annual conference was riveted. "I spent most of my life," Thomas began, his speech slow but clear, "believing human beings were just complex computers. I built artificial intelligence systems that could mimic human thought, but I missed the essential element, the soul." He paused, gathering strength. 40 years ago, I fired a cleaning lady because her daughter dared to share joy with my paralyzed child. Today, that daughter is the reason I can stand before you, not just physically, but spiritually." The presentation continued with brain scans, data, testimonies. But the real testimony was Thomas himself, living proof that transformation was possible at any age, in any condition. After the conference, a young medical student approached Grace. "Dr. Foster, I'm struggling to reconcile my scientific training with what I've witnessed in your program. How do you balance faith and science?" Grace smiled, remembering her own journey. "Science tells us how. Faith tells us why. They're not opposing forces, but complementary truths. When we limit ourselves to only what we can measure, we miss the immeasurable aspects of human existence: hope, love, purpose, grace." As the years passed, the story of Grace, Charlotte, and Thomas became legendary in medical and religious circles alike. Books were written, documentaries produced, but the real impact was in the thousands of lives transformed by their work. On Grace's 60th birthday, a celebration was held at the original Miracles in Motion Center. Patients from around the world had gathered, many walking who'd been told they never would, many believing who'd thought faith was impossible. Thomas, now 80 but still mobile, took the microphone. "I want to tell you all a story," he began. Once upon a time there was a foolish man who thought he was wise. He built towers of intelligence, but had no wisdom. He accumulated wealth, but possessed no riches. He had a daughter, but offered no real love. He paused, his eyes finding grace in the crowd. Then God sent him angels, disguised as the people he'd wronged. They taught him that the wisdom of this world is foolishness to God, that true wealth is stored in heaven, that love isn't earned, but given. Charlotte joined him on stage, now in her 50s, her own children watching from the audience. "That foolish man was my father," she said, "and those angels were Grace and her mother, Miriam. They showed us that God's strength is made perfect in weakness, that His grace is sufficient for all our failures." Grace was called to the stage, where hundreds of voices began singing "Amazing Grace." As she looked out at the sea of faces, each representing a story of redemption, she thought of her mother. "Mama always said that those with good hearts find a way to shine," Grace said into the microphone. But she was only partially right. It's not our goodness that makes us shine. It's God's goodness working through our broken places, turning our deepest wounds into our greatest victories. As the celebration continued, a young girl in a wheelchair was brought forward. Her name was Miriam, named after the woman whose faith had started it all. She'd been told she'd never walk, but her eyes held the same hope Grace had seen in Charlotte's eyes decades ago. "Will you teach me to dance?" little Miriam asked Grace. Grace knelt beside the wheelchair, remembering another girl, another time, another dance that changed everything. "Sweet child," she said, "let's start with moving your heart toward heaven. The rest will follow." As music filled the center, as patients and doctors, believers and seekers, young and old, began to move together, the truth that Miriam Foster had lived became visible. Faith isn't about perfection, but about surrender, not about earning, but about receiving, not about pride, but about grace. Thomas watched from his chair, his eyes wet with tears of gratitude. He'd spent the first 60 years of his life building artificial intelligence. He'd spent whatever years remained witnessing to divine intelligence, the God who could take an atheist's arrogance and transform it into amazing grace. The dance continued, as it always had, as it always would, in the hearts of those who discovered that the smallest seed of faith, even faith the size of a mustard seed, could move mountains, heal bodies, and transform souls. And somewhere in heaven, Miriam Foster danced with the angels, her faith finally sight, her hope finally fulfilled, her love finally perfected in the presence of the one who makes all things new. The story of Grace, Charlotte, and Thomas became more than medical history. It became a testament to the profound truth that God's ways are not our ways, His thoughts not our thoughts, and His grace sufficient for every failure, every wound, every impossible situation. Years later, when Grace finally retired, she established the Dancing with Angels program, specifically designed for children whose parents had been wronged by systems of power. Each child received not just medical treatment, but mentorship, education, and most importantly, the message that their worth wasn't determined by their circumstances, but by the God who loved them. Thomas funded the program entirely, saying, "I spent decades creating artificial intelligence that could learn from its mistakes. Now I'm learning that divine intelligence uses our mistakes to teach us about grace." Charlotte, who had become a renowned minister and therapist, often said in her sermons, "God doesn't waste anything, not even our pain. He transforms it into purpose, our wounds into wisdom, our failures into foundations for His glory." The mansion where it all began, where a young Grace had been humiliated for dancing, was eventually purchased by Thomas and transformed into a retreat center for families dealing with paralysis and disability. The conservatory where Charlotte had watched Grace being sent away became a chapel, its windows still casting golden light, but now onto people learning to dance with their limitations, to find joy in their struggles, to discover faith in their darkest moments. On the wall of that chapel hung a simple plaque. in memory of Miriam Foster, who cleaned these floors with her hands and blessed them with her faith. Her legacy lives on in every child who learns to dance, every heart that learns to believe, every life transformed by amazing grace. And so the dance continued, generation after generation, a testament to the truth that love never fails, hope never disappoints, and faith, even faith as small as a child's dance in a marble conservatory, can move mountains and change the world.